Okay, and secondly, we have a guest speaker today. This is Ken Monshine, who belongs to a medieval society, and he is going to explain what he does and talk to us today about medieval sports and games. So I really appreciate your coming, Ken, and it's all yours.
Thank you. Good morning. Can you all hear me all right? Oh yeah, I'm amplified. Excellent. So as Father Vidmar said, my name is Ken Monshine. I received my doctorate in medieval history from Fordham University. I'm a bona fide history professor. But I am also, as Father Vidmar also said, a participant in various modern medieval sports, games, reenactments. So what I'd like to speak to you about today is about community and sport, because I want to talk to you about medieval sport, but I want to talk to you about sport and how it's used in a community building context, and to differentiate within communities and to also build solidarity within communities. Of course, there's many sorts of communities. There's faith communities, of course, Catholic Church in America, for instance, right, which you may be familiar with. Hopefully, slightly. There are communities, of course, also of sports, right? Who's a Pats fan? Any Pats fans? No? Any Red Sox fans? You all better be Pats fans, or most of them, yeah. Apparently your grade in the course depends on being a Pats fan. But sports, though, in the past were used to build communities. So what I am going to talk to you today about is actually based off a paper I've got coming out on difference and exclusion within communities and the way that that is built and reinforced through sport in the Middle Ages. So if I were to say medieval sport, I mean, what's the first thing you'd probably think about? You know, if it's sports in the Middle Ages, what do you think of? Anyone? Bueller? Ooh, bystander effect. Oh, yeah. Yeah, like jousting, right? Exactly, like knightly sports, right? Probably maybe the first thing comes to mind. But the question then is, what about, that's like one group, right? That's just the second estate. That's just the nobility. What about other groups? What about other sorts of status differentials? So let me begin with a little bit of theory. This is Pierre Bourdieu. He is a French theorist. I'm sorry to foist some continental philosophy upon you this early in the morning. But I want to talk about how sport is central to the construction of, well, really two categories I'm going to talk about because I only have so much time. One is going to be class, social class, and the other is going to be gender. I'll speak about gender first. I'll also talk about how those intersect. Because this is the Middle Ages, I could do many, many more. I could talk about estate, sports and the clergy, sports and the laicity, right? The community of laymen. But I wanted to take these two because they may, because even though the sports teams here are the friars, I thought that talking about gender and talking about social class may resonate a little bit more, at the risk, of course, presentism, at the risk of just using the past to talk about the present. I want to use the Middle Ages to talk to you about things that are going on in our present society. And then I'll conclude a little bit with modern medieval sports and how the idea of the Middle Ages is used for some modern grassroots sports. Because, of course, there are new sports that come around all the time, right? Basketball came from somewhere, right? In Springfield in the 19th century, right? For instance. But let's talk about Pierre Bourdieu for a moment. For Bourdieu, sport is one of the things that is central to social systems, that in any society, there are the haves and the have-nots, right? Big concern in this presidential election season. And I want to talk to you about his idea of how sport is involved with this idea of habitus, good vocabulary word to know, habitus. Let's suppose, who's been to a Whole Foods? Show of hands, right? It's a little bougie, isn't it? You go to Whole Foods, and what sort of cars do you see in the parking lot? Prius, right? Maybe some Volvos, Subarus, right? Things like that, right? It's a bit bougie, right? Let's suppose for a moment that we want to break into one of those automobiles. We managed to jump start it, even though it's probably got one of those new style push button starters. And we drive off, and what's playing on the radio? Well, it's probably NPR or classic rock, okay? Let's suppose now we go to maybe a middle-of-the-road supermarket, right? The cops are chasing us. We got to ditch the Prius. And we go to a middle-of-the-road supermarket, say up by me. I live in Massachusetts. We're Stop and Shop, right? Maybe I think it's in Rhode Island too. And we go there, and we ditch the Prius. We hijack what? A Honda Accord, right? That's what you're going to find in sort of the middle-of-the-road shopping, middle of the road, right? And we break in, and what's playing on the radio? Well, probably top 40 or something, right? So then, the cops are hot on our tail. We decide we got to go, and wait, there's a Family Dollar there, right? There's scratch and dent grocery store. We go in, and the cars in the lot are maybe they're beaters, right? Maybe you got some beat up pickup trucks and stuff, or maybe people took the bus there. We take one, what's playing? Probably country music, right? Or again, top 40. The idea behind this, Pierre Bourdieu's idea, well, not his idea of habitus, but the idea of habitus, which he elaborated upon, is that what we like, our taste, what we like, is a function of our social class, right? People shop at Whole Foods, not because the food is really any better, it doesn't taste any better, it's basically the same. They do it as an article of consumption. Look at me, I care about the earth, so I drove my Prius to Whole Foods to buy this, organic stuff and whatnot, right? And I made Jeff Bezos richer thereby. Sport is the same way. That our social class is negotiated by our consumption of what he calls sporting products. So I'll give you some examples. Cricket in former British colonies is a huge marker, huge class. The only thing India and Pakistan have historically stopped a war for is for cricket matches. In the UK, right, people are rabid football, by which, of course, I mean American soccer supporters. And, of course, American sports, right? People riot when their team wins or loses the championship. This is all signs of belonging and not belonging to groups, right? The groups of Pats fans, right? Red Sox Nation tells you something. It's called Red Sox Nation, right? So, but also with social class, right? Anyone here planning to go down to Newport for yachting season? I'm not. I can't do that, right? Who owns a $100,000 dressage horse? Not very many people own $100,000 dressage horses. So polo, right? Polo, right? These are typically upper class sports in our country, right? That's why, there's something aspirational to the Ralph Lauren polo logo. Yoga and jogging, these are firmly middle class things, right? This is things that you read about in the New York Times. Oh, yoga, it's so good for you, right? You should run, everyone should run, very middle class thing. But mixed martial arts, football, a lot of middle class moms and dads near where I live, they don't want their kids to play American football anymore. Concussions, right? But mixed martial arts, boxing, bodybuilding, those are generally have sort of a working class mentality to them. Right? Used to be there alive Jewish boxers, not so much anymore. Generally speaking, people who can make a living doing things other than getting punched in the face tend to take those options. Just saying, right? So things are associated with class. So, same with the Middle Ages. I want to talk about how gender is used to construct differences. And I'm going to talk about differences between Northern Europe, especially in Southern Europe, but various sorts of differences vis-a-vis gender, class, and then I'm going to look at constructions of communities and construction of ideology in modern medievalisms, right? Modern sport medievalisms, especially. So let's start, right? So one would think that sport would be a male activity, wholly, but it's not. Women, and here is from manuscript Bodley 264, women and men, there we have nuns and monks playing a ball game with a ball and a bat, some predecessor of some predecessor of baseball, perhaps stool ball, right? Other ball games. Women did participate in these. We have evidence of this, particularly in Northern Europe. Why in Northern Europe? I'll talk to you about that in a moment. Another example, the early 15th century, Le Ménager de Paris. He is writing instructions to his young wife on how to keep the house, but he also reports that there's a female player named Margot, who came from Brabant, which is now modern Belgium, regularly beating male players in jeu de paume, which is the ancestor of tennis. It's sort of indoor tennis in Paris in 1428. So women did play ball games, right? And this was obviously something remarkable. Women could, of course, play gentler if we want to consider chess as a competitive sport. Women could play chess right here, Otto IV of Brandenburg. Sorry, that's the wrong manuscript attribution. Sorry, there's tennis at the Royal Court of France, right? They're playing the indoor tennis, right? And of course, women rode, right? Riding horses was a marker of social class, something that you would do. They wouldn't necessarily do so as competitively, but they would do it. Hunting can be considered as a sport. Here we have women shooting bows and hunt and do other things, falconry. So things that we may not consider so much as sports today, but certainly we'd put in the realm of athletic, active activity. So why the difference between Northern and Southern Europe, though? Well, part of it has to do with a cultural difference. And I want to talk to you about the Northern and Southern European marriage patterns. This is, of course, the Arnolfini wedding by Jan van Eyck. It is in the National Gallery in London. And if you look at this, this is done in a Flemish, that is a Northern European style. It's egg tempera, which is pigments dissolved in egg white on a board which gives you very glowing jewel-like tones. At the point when this was made, the Southern Europeans were experimenting with oil and canvas, of course. But this depicts a Italian couple, the Arnolfinis, who are betrothed and they're going to be married. There's a lot of symbology in there, like the dog is a symbol of loyalty, the patents, which were wooden overshoes. But the thing you notice about this is that he looks a lot older than she does, doesn't she? She's also holding up her dress in such a way to suggest a pregnant stomach. But what I want to concentrate on, of course, is the age differential between these two. Now, amongst people in this room, I'm guessing most of you are between the ages of 18 and 21. And is anyone planning to get married anytime soon? No. OK. Anyone planning to live at home with your parents till you get married? No. The fact you're in college says no. OK. So none of you, all right, I won't ask what you do with your personal lives, but none of you are planning to get married anytime soon. None of you are planning to stay at home with your parents. I'm assuming you're all planning to get jobs. Who's planning to get a job after graduation? Make money, right? And you got to get your house, right? You got to get your ducks in a row, right, before you get married, right? This is this modern thing that we do, right? This is what we call the Northern European marriage pattern, first described by John Hagenau. And it has a late age in marriage. Both men and women work outside their home, the family home. Women often go into service. People are usually, because they're semi-independent of their families, of course they always ask their families for advice and consent. Marriage was always something that was somewhat social in nature, especially back in the day, right? People didn't really elope so much, but the idea was that you get to choose your own partners, right? You have more freedom in choosing your own partners. You're more independent, closer in age. And as a result, also you have fewer children because you tend to get married a little bit later, early 20s. So fewer children in general because you're married for less of your fertile life. Sort of like one thing that's causing the baby bust in America. The reason why the American population is growing is because of immigration. So the Southern pattern, right? And this is sort of familiar to me. I grew up in South Brooklyn in the 80s. And it was a heavily Sicilian neighborhood. And my female friends and my friends' sisters, their conservative dads would say, don't you bring dishonor on the family, right? This whole idea of the honor of the family is in the chastity of the woman, what we call an honor culture. It still happens many places throughout the world, often with very unfortunate results. But here, women are kept under the control of their families, and they're married off. They tend to be married off young. And Romeo and Juliet, don't forget, Juliet was like 14 and she was engaged. High proportion of marriage, until, of course, families can't pay the dowries. In Northern Europe, women earn their own dowries. Southern Europe, well, the family is expected to give her a dowry, right? Money that goes with her into marriage that will support her if she's going to be widowed. Husbands tend to be much older. They need to have the resources to get married, so they tend to be much older than their wives, in their 30s. So women are normatively kept home with a high degree of familial control. So it stands to reason that in Northern Europe, where women are working outside the home and they are more independent, well, they're also going to participate more in sporting activity. And in fact, things like Subal were, also courting activities, a way to perhaps meet a potential mate. In the South, well, your dad's going to decide who you're going to marry. So that's one differential. Women engaged in other activities too. My own special sphere of research is actually in fencing books. I'm a fencing coach. And the first fencing book that we possess comes from 1325, and it depicts a woman who's named Walpurgis in the text. And she is depicted fencing with a priest and his student, with swords and bucklers. Why? Who is she? What's she doing there? Is she one of the student's girlfriends? Is she Saint Walpurgis? Considering this is something that made by students in a cathedral school, right? That is, people who were clergy, and they put a woman in this. Did women participate in this in southern Germany in fencing? It's very, 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 very orderly fashion, much like a liturgical book. It's a very, very interesting manuscript. And what she's doing there, well, we're not even quite sure. Another example, I'm going to give a bunch of examples from the 16th century, even though the 16th century is, properly speaking, not the Middle Ages, because I'm a little obsessed with the 16th century. But Ana de Mendoza, a famous beauty, who lost an eye, supposedly, as a young girl in a fencing accident. They didn't have masks back then. And this, was seen as actually a sort of beauty mark. And arguably, that in Spain, because of course Spain was reconquered, there was the Reconquista, because women had a large part to play in this, especially defense of towns and other places, because to take territory in the Middle Ages, you had to resettle it, which means you had to move your women in, because women are, of course, the reproducers of culture. So if we're going to re-Christianize the Iberian Peninsula, we need to bring in women to reproduce Christian culture. Well, because women had such a large part in this, and of course the Spanish obsession with hidalguismo and gentlemanliness and the wearing of swords, maybe this was something more permitted amongst women. There were certainly knightly orders for women in Spain and a number of other martial attributes, right? The thing about gender in the Middle Ages too, though, is that especially by the 16th century, there were people warning against women doing this, that there's a policing of women. Part of this is the sort of strange medieval idea of gender. We are used to in the modern world of thinking that men are men and women are women. Of course, as more science comes out and intersex activism is a thing, that we realize that there's some cases in between, right? Of course, St. Paul knew that back in the day when he was writing to the Corinthians. But medieval people saw sex as a gradation, right? The reason why that both men and women have a part to play in reproduction, producing seed, for instance, but the reason why you develop in your mother's womb into a male or female is either the climate in there is it's dry and warm, or it's cool and moist. This influences the developing embryo to become male or female. So of course, goes back to Hippocrates and Galen, the whole humoral theory. So the problem, though, is that, of course, if you are female and you exercise too much, then your genitalia might evert, and you might become evert, not invert, I'm sorry, and you will become male. The French essayist Michel de Montaigne in the 16th century talks about a girl named Marie who was chasing some pigs and jumped over a fence, and she was too warm, and her genitalia everted, and she became a boy, and they renamed her Germaine. This is, of course, apocryphal, but there was this discourse, right? What is proper to men, what is proper to women? As recently, of course, as the 50s and 60s, they said, oh, no, women should not exercise too vigorously because, of course, that will harm their reproductive capacity. So maybe not, right? We still get that too, right? Women say, oh, I don't want to lift. I will become too manly. My muscles will get huge. I will look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, which, of course, does not happen. A little interlude, right? While we're talking about the 16th century, while we're talking about fencing books. What about the intersection of class? Well, we haven't really talked about masculinity, right? Obviously, performing in athletic competitions, right, is a manly thing to do. But what about the intersection of masculinity and class? Quoting Anne Tolstoy, her wonderful book on martial culture in 16th century Germany, by the 16th century, bearing weapons, carrying weapons, wearing sidearms was a sign of being an enfranchised male in the cities of Germany, what would become Germany. We'll call it the Holy Roman Empire, because that's what they called it back then. Of course, it was neither Holy nor Roman nor an empire, but we'll get, that you can cover that when you do the Congress of Vienna. Men must be able to defend their honor. And of course, this is not a sport. This is talking about fighting. This is talking about dueling, which is another sphere entirely. But to practice for this, well, that's fencing, and that's a sport, right? Because obviously, when you're practicing swordplay, you don't actually want to kill anybody. And there were these fencing guilds that began actually in the 15th century in Germany. Why? What were these fencing guilds, these strange things where people would get together? The modern descendant of that, of course, is the Menser amongst German college students. You've ever seen in a movie, two guys are standing there dressed in gimp outfits and slashing each other's faces with sabers. That is the Menser. It's a ritualized duel that's still done by certain German student fraternities. But even though this is something that was done in Germany, shooting sports, always more practical, right? You want to defend your town. Well, it's the age of gunpowder warfare, and before that, of course, crossbows, right? A standoff weapon is certainly much, much more practical, especially if you're a townsman and not a knight. So first, crossbow guilds, studied by Laura Crombie, and then after that, shooting, that's a Schützenfest. And German shooting societies actually lasted well. They're still active today. You can see in many places people bicycling with their rifles slung over their backs to the shooting range. It's still there. Switzerland, excellent example. Every Swiss family has a rifle. And of course, these shooting clubs were brought over to America. They were German shooting clubs in America until they got renamed around World War I for the obvious reasons. But shooting sports were, they huge, right? And practical. They want to encourage this, right? In England, you're supposed to practice with your longbow. Everyone is supposed to practice. So what place did fencing have in this? So, well, here is Strasbourg. Let's turn to the city of Strasbourg, which I've studied in some detail, and building also off of my friend Olivier Dupuis's really excellent archival research there. They had a lot of shooting competitions there. Shooting was really important to their image of themselves as a community. Because it was also a symbol of the city, which was an independent city-state, right? It was like Rhode Island, right? Except even smaller. And it was a symbol of their ability to defend themselves against any hostile forces, right? Local robber barons who maybe wanted to kidnap their citizens for money or affect their trade up and down the river. So what's the place of fencing competitions, which were brutal competitions, right? You get together, and the aim was to draw blood from the other guy's head with these kind of fairly sharp swords, right? They're not deadly sharp. They're like big spatulas, really, only sharp. And the aim is to hit the other guy in the head and to draw blood. So what's the place of this? Well, my friend Olivier, he goes into the city council records where you had to ask for permission to hold a fencing competition because of the civic disorder. And usually you had to have it like in an inn-yard, right? Someplace that was closed in, a courtyard. And he found a whole lot of applications there. The evidence is that these guys who held the competition, the Fechtmeister, the fencing masters, come from a bunch of different towns. And they're members of these guild-like structures. They tend to be held on Monday, which are the journeyman's days off. And that there's this common idea of Fechterbrauch, of fencing custom, to translate it loosely, which is understood through all the towns of the empire, and which dictates fair play in what you do, because it's not like there's like a rule book, right? It's not like modern sport where there's a firm rule book. And this tells us that in an age when these journeymen are becoming proletarianized, right, the 1% is getting richer, and they're kind of kept in this perpetual adolescence, not unlike us today, right, where again, marriage is the capstone of establishing a middle-class life, and none of you plan to get married soon, whereas in, say, like, my parents, or even more especially my grandparents' day, kind of you got married and then you built your life together, right? Well, today, back then, I should say, I'm sorry, it became more and more difficult for these journeymen to establish themselves as masters, as householders, to have traditional adult masculinity, not unlike today. So instead, they're having these fencing competitions to show their martial masculinity, right? This is a statement of who we are and what we're doing. So it has a social use. You dig it? All right. So it's this assertion, so that's the next slide, right? It's this assertion of enfranchisement, assertion of masculinity, extra money, diversion, and sport, because you can also make money off of it. And they also had, it was also a social activity. These guys had drinking sessions and stuff together, not in like modern sports teams, bonding, right? First thing that happens when you get drafted to the NFL is you got to buy dinner for the whole team. So these things happen there too. We'll talk more about that, right? Keep this in mind, this idea of masculinity and assertion of masculinity when we get to the modern medieval sports. So, same thing I want to mention, since we were talking about the differences between northern and southern Italy before. There's also martial sports in southern Italy, but I want to point out that these were experienced more communally than in the north. That a fencing competition is a de facto organized thing. In the south, in many, many Italian cities, you had organized factional fighting between teams that represented the various quarters of a city, the parishes, the Contrade, whatever you want to call them. These go back, to late antiquity. These go back all the way back, and these can be very, very working class. That's a 17th century engraving of a Pisan participant in the Gioco di Ponte, the bridge battles, which is still kind of reenacted today, only they do it as a tug-of-war. But those shields were used for striking and for defending. And he's wearing a sort of closed helmet with a grill on it, which is sort of a helmet that was never used in warfare, but only in these battles. So specialized equipment, certainly a feature of sport. And they would do this also with fists, right? And depending on the town, right? Battaglie de pugni, the fists. Battaglie de sassi, stone throwing, which persisted, as a ritualized pastime amongst Italian youth, well, through the 19th century, through the 20th century. We're bored, what do you want to do? Is throw rocks at each other. And it was fought for control of geography. But the important thing is that this was something done communally, right? This is something that is done, and it had its origin in sort of military practice, military drill, or military fighting. It became an expression of working class enfranchisement and masculinity, and also sometimes noble enfranchisement and masculinity, because nobles were allowed to participate as well. Another example, of course, is the Palio from Siena, the famous Palio, which you may have heard of. It's a horse race held a couple times a year between the 17 the 17 Contrade, not 727 in Siena, typo. They've done this since at least the year 1200. Still goes on today. It also has some class differentials because, of course, it may be a working class guy risking his neck riding those horses bareback around the piazza, but those really fine Brabant horses or Barbary horses from North Africa, and there was a huge, huge trade in horses back in the day. Well, they're going to be supplied by a noble patron. And of course, it also has, having the best horses in your city also has clear military implications. So here, for civic purposes, I'm sorry, I put this PowerPoint together when I was quite sleepy. So that brings us, of course, the equestrian sport par excellence is what you said before, jousting, the tournament. And we'll look at this, and we're going to see how this was used to establish class. And it was used to establish class. It was used to show class, because of course you can't take part in a tournament unless you're a noble, right? We have fencing, right? These mass battles of footmen. These are pastimes that more or less anyone can take part in, right? They're rough and tumble. You can get killed. You can get severely injured. But open to most anyone. Tournament, tournament, properly speaking, is a horseback sport. It requires expensive armor. And this is something that anyone can do. But the tournament, I want to point out, goes back a long, long way. It's not something they certainly came up with. Some chroniclers say, oh yes, they invented the tournament. Well, no, it goes back to Roman drills described in late Roman military manuals. One that, because in order to fight effectively as a cavalry unit, you have to practice riding formation, turning your horses around as a unit, spinning, much like modern equestrian carousels, things like that. I don't know if anyone rides or has ever seen like a equestrian drill team, but people still do this kind of stuff, albeit without swords and stuff. So it starts maybe, even with the back of the Carolingians in the 8th and 9th centuries, because you got to practice this stuff. The word tournament comes actually from this wheeling around of cavalry formations, this getting the horses used to riding close packed together, turning around, feigning retreats, turning around. Cavalry tactics that, had been familiar to Alexander the Great. Only so many ways to ride a horse and to use a horse in battle, and people tend to figure them out pretty quickly under pressure. But of course, and by the 12th century, which I should say that the church condemned this, in some cases if you died in a tournament, because it's a rough sport. You couldn't be buried on sacred ground, right? But it had grown up in northern France. And these first tournaments, they were not two guys. Anyone see A Knight's Tale? Show of hands. No? Anyone ever gone to Renaissance Fair, see jousting? Has anyone seen jousting in a movie? If I say jousting, all right. So you get one guy, right? Two guys, right? Who's seen Game of Thrones? Jousting tournaments for a season, and they decide not to spend money on horses. And they'll CGI horses, which you can tell if you know what horses look like, because it's like, oh, there's that horse, and there's that horse, and it's like 27 of the same horse in the big scene. Anyway, so it's one guy, and they run into each other, right? Well, they didn't do that. These were these mass scrums, like rugby scrums, only on horseback. And the aim is to beat the snot out of the other guys and to capture horses. Because, of course, horses are expensive commodities. Good horses that are willing to do this stuff are even more expensive commodities. A horse that, is going to be strong enough and big enough to carry you in armor while still being agile. Sorry. That's going to be hard to get. They didn't have these big draft horses. Those are, 18th century breeding inventions, but they had these more like a quarter horse, right? More like my paint, really. We'll talk about that, right? So, and of course, tournaments were nobles. They got together. They could conspire. They could conspire against the king to overthrow the king, right? Henry II legislated against them because he didn't want his barons getting together and the pretext of tournaments to overthrow him. So all these things happen. But they're also praised as a source of training. This is Roger the Hovid, and he uses the term Athleticus, which was used in a lot of early hagiography, that is writing about saints' lives, or Christian writings. Often martyrs of the church were called athletes, right? Athletes for Christ. But here he's taking this term athlete and he's using it for knights. Part of, knights trying to conceive of their job as an order on par with the priesthood, which was something that happened as well. But no athlete, he says, can fight tenaciously who has never received any blows. He must see his blood flow, hear his teeth crack. Under the fist of his adversary, when he's thrown to the ground, he must fight him with all his might, must not lose courage. So basically, he uses all this classicizing language to say, yeah, how the heck can you be a good knight? How can you be a good warrior, a good soldier, if you don't first try yourself in mock battle in the tournament, which is scarcely less violent than real battle? So the aim here is to defeat knights, to capture horses here. He's coming up behind the guy, right? So he's got some captured horses over there. He's overthrowing him, and he's going to take his horse. There, you can see kind of how the other guy's got a shield also around his neck with a strap. And then you come to the attention of powerful patrons. So let's say if you're a poor knight, you can afford just your armor and your horse, like William the Marshal, who went from being a poor knight to being basically the most important guy in England, essentially the Secretary of State, and then, of course, the regent for the infant king. This is how you made your fortune, by being good at sports, sort of like playing golf with the boss back in the 50s. And this sorts of thing, here's the famous Menas manuscript, continued into the 14th century. That guy's got the other guy in a headlock. His helmet's come off, right? This is a rough sport. He's wailing on the other guy, right there, and he's got the other guy in a headlock, and he's wailing on him with the sword. Yeah, this is not a genteel sport here. So it serves a lot of purposes. Get more horses, get more breeding stock. Of course, horses, for big, powerful animals, they die rather easily. Mm-hmm. I'm going to get to that. But you did have the individual stuff in the beginning here. But it's sort of like a preliminary thing before the main event, which is this big melee in the 14th century. And people wrote tournaments on this. Geoffroy de Charny, who is one of the most important knights of 14th century France, wrote questions on the war, a joust tournament and war, which were all kind of, for him, gradations of the same thing. And the essential question is, who gets the horse, right? It's all about who gets the horse. And then what happens is something called the 100 Years' War, which breaks out in mid-14th century. Why? Because it's basically, to give you a very, 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 very short process, a generations-long struggle to see if the King of England is also going to be the King of France. That's basically what it is. But it's intermittent, right? And unlike in the movies, medieval warfare was not, you line your army up there, I'll line my army up there, and we'll run at each other, right? Don't believe Game of Thrones. No medieval commander would ever do anything that stupid. Why? I got a castle. I'm going to stay in my castle. Come attack my castle, right? Oh, you don't want to attack my castle? You're going to, okay, we're going to raid you, destroy your supply lines, right? Pick off your sentries, right? You can't leave that castle there in your rear, or town for that matter, because towns are also fortified spots. But besieging it, well, you're all going to die of dysentery before we give up, right? So this is called Vitigian warfare, because this was counseled by Vitigius, who is a late Roman writer, right? What he says is, go and destroy their crops. Don't line the castle. Make them give battle to you. Destroy their crops, kill the peasants, right? Embarrass them, destroy their economic base. Then they'll have to come to you. This is what the English did to the French, and this is why the English basically had the ball through most of the 100 Years' War. But people got bored during this, right? People got bored during this. Never mind the slide, right? What they would do is they would ride out, and you see this in the chroniclers and stuff. Like they'd ride out and they'd say, "Okay, we're passing by this fortified castle. We're not going to fight with them. I'm bored. I'm going to go fight with them." Guy rides out, right? Risks himself, his armor himself, right? Fights with them, comes back, and it was like, "Oh my God, what a great deed! This guy is a real knight. He went and fought those other knights, and it was great." But this is totally not discipline. You're a commander. You don't want random members of your army going out with their expensive equipment, which of course they supply themselves and their horses, and risking themselves and their stuff to go fight random people. And what's more, the tournament starts coming under royal control. Because especially when you got these great nobles, like Boucicault, Boucicault the Younger, the Marshal of France, like these high nobility of France. Boucicault, Reginald de Roy, and the Lord de Sampy, right, who are chamberlains of the king, right? They're in the king's inner circle. And they go and they challenge a bunch of English knights who are in the English king's court in 1389. And the two kings are like, crap. Our guys are fighting each other, right? We got this carefully negotiated truce, but they're bored, and they want to go fight each other to show that they're true members of the nobility, because that's what you do when you're noble, you fight. Lord knows what other politics were going on underneath the surface. And they say, okay, you know what we're going to do? We're going to take control of this. We're going to patronize this. And we are going to make this something that is royally sponsored, top down, right? Sort of like the NFL. Sort of more like modern sport, right? Just top down. It's not grassroots. You don't get to make up your own rules, right? And like kids do, right? That we've got the NCAA. NCAA gives you rules, right? For fencing, we've got the FIE. The FIE gives you rules. You can't, you know, I'm fencing with somebody. I can't say, okay, today let's not count touches in the arms. It's not what the sport is, right? So in the same way, the tournament starts getting organized top down. And it's this point that we start seeing those one-on-one contests, which can be much, much better controlled. This is when jousting, per se, starts happening. And then the equipment starts getting more and more specialized. For the first time, instead of having the horses just running each other in an open field, which is the risk for collision or very hard hit, by the 1420s, they've got a barrier to divide the horses to make sure they run better. And there's all this pageantry, and everything goes around it. So by the 15th century tournament, it becomes highly, highly symbolic. This is René d'Anjou's tournament book from the mid-15th century. It is binding the nobility closest to the ruler, and it's helping to build the state. What is a state, you ask me? It's a country, a modern country, like France or England, where the king is going to be the absolute ruler. The king is going to have, in the words of the German sociologist Max Weber, the authoritative monopoly on violence. This isn't going to truly happen until the modern era, but part of it is that they're trying to get the violence under control, because in the Middle Ages, the right to violence, which is part of this nebulous thing called franchise, is spread all through the noble class. Everyone in the noble class is essentially the sheriff, right? They can administer God's justice by virtue of their office as knights. But the kings want to take this. They want to have the one army, right? Because they're the ones who can afford all the gunpowder weapons now, which can knock down castles. We'll talk about that, right? And it starts coming to the fore, right? So, but of course, I should point out that the judicial duel, the tournament, and war bleed one into another. And dueling was something that is, well, it was done up to World War I, right? Even extraditionally. The Council of Trent, which of course, as you all know, came together to fight the Reformation, right? But in 1568, I believe, they made the duel formally illegal. All Catholic countries, it was illegal in all Catholic countries after the 1560s. And then, of course, Protestant countries soon thereafter. But it was tolerated, right? This was part of manliness, was to defend your honor with your sword, which you wore. And, of course, this didn't need to be deadly, and because it shades into these deeds of arms in the 15th century. It shades into the sporting practice and challenges. And that, in turn, shades into warfare proper, because all a duel is a war of two. Duel bellorum. And it could be very often because of a question of honor. For instance, the French knight Boucicault and Galeazzo de Mantua, who was an Italian nobleman, fought a judicial combat, or actually two of them, because Boucicault insulted the honor of Italian knights. No Italian could possibly be a good knight. Galeazzo said, yeah, I'll show you. And they actually fight a couple of sanctioned tournaments. Of course, they're, well, not tournaments, I should say. They're duels, but they're also sports. They're like prize fights, because there's a chance to get seriously hurt, but of course they was stopped. They're wearing full armor, which does tend to protect one. Stopped before anyone was seriously hurt in these. But it was to prove the point, to prove that they would fight. Of course, it would be a diplomatic mess if someone actually got killed. why was this so? What was going on in the 15th century? Well, part of it was because of the post-Black Death economy. In short, after the Black Death, well, let's start from the get-go. The way nobility in the Middle Ages made their living was grain, land. Land is wealth, and the basic commodity is grain, because you have a subsistence level agricultural society. The biggest commodity is grain, food. Grain equals food. So that is the petroleum, right? That is the bits of the digital economy. It's grain back in the day. Grain is the tail wagging the dog of the peasant economy. But what happens is the price is very high. Population is very high, so the price is very high. You only have so much land. But then everyone dies in the Black Death. Land, price of grain falls. Meanwhile, supply of labor, also down. So, because there's still work needs to be done, people start asking for more wages. So if you're a noble, you're getting squeezed in the middle between your labor costs and the price of your grain. Labor costs are going up, price of grain is going down. The nobility tend to rent out their properties. Like, hey, you want to rent out my fields and just pay me a sum per year, and then maybe you don't have to work anymore with your own hands. You'll join the gentry class. You'll employ other people to work that. Maybe you'll rent out my mill and then use it to smelt iron out and start the industrial economy. This is going to happen. While warfare also very slowly changes due to this military revolution, that hiding in the castles and towns and strong points is no longer going to work because now we got cannon, right? 1453, the Turks use a cannon designed by an Italian engineer to batter down the walls of Constantinople, ending the Roman Empire in the east. So, gunpowder weapons. Not that they shoot through knight's armor, but they destroy your fortresses. So now you got to go out. You got to get battle, which means the guy at the biggest army is going to win. So the need to finance these new, larger armies in the age of gunpowder weapons is the tail wagging the dog of state formation. You dig that? So all of this is what leads to the nobility, who are no longer really serving as much of a purpose on the battlefield, if indeed they ever did. That's a matter of controversy. But certainly the armored knight is not winning the day on the battlefield anymore, because it is way, way cheaper to get 100 guys with sharp, pointy sticks than one armored knight. And 100 guys with sharp, pointy sticks can kill a whole lot of armored knights. Way more cost effective to have those guys. But they still want to be on top of the social ladder, which is why the tournament, right? And being able to afford the horses and the armor and the specialized armor and all of that, in order to do that, shows who you are, right? And meanwhile, remember that those middling sorts are coming up too. Not just the people in the countryside joining the gentry class and not having to work for themselves, but also in the cities and towns, you got this prosperous burgher class, these middle class people. There is a civic joust in, I believe, Siena. That's 16th century, so it's a little bit later. So the nobles need to differentiate themselves, right? Here's a 16th century Nuremberg, a joust there. So here's King René's. So King René, in his tournament book, is rather anachronistically calling for an old-style tournament melee with a lot of heraldry and retainers and expensive specialized equipment, just to show your nobility. And part of it is this very ritualistic display where they take and they put the helmets with all their crests in a cloister and they set them up there. And then if anyone is not sufficiently noble, as you can see they're doing there, they knock your helmet over with a stick and like, oh, not this guy. He didn't have four grandparents who are sufficiently noble, or they haven't behaved in the manner befitting their class. Well, your helmet gets knocked over and you get punished. Or sometimes ritually, sometimes they actually expel you. But this is the whole idea of maintaining class boundaries in this world, right? And of course, though, the tournament remains a path of upward mobility. Jacques de Lalaing, one of the greatest knights of the 15th century, goes on tour. And he fights a whole bunch of guys, fighting challenges, especially on foot, against other knights, other people of his class. But he does this, he has a passport. Basically, he goes and he applies for the right to do this from the local ruler, and he's got noble patrons. Right? This is, again, the consolidation of power in the aristocracy and the, moving towards an autocratic system of government. So the way in which these sorts of noble combats were done bespeaks this growth of states. Right? And they're essentially contractual, just like there's a contract for a modern boxing match. He travels around with these chapters of arms and specifies how the combat's going to take place and what the rules are, right? And he's also, some of them say, no, I don't want you to do this. I want you to get yourself killed in my territory. It's going to be terribly embarrassing. No, they're not going to do this. There you go. And I should point out also that really up until the modern era, these equestrian sports, tournaments continued, that Queen Elizabeth had a tournament every year on the anniversary of her coming to the throne. It's called the Session Day. And the nobility bought all this fancy armor, and they got together basically to show that, yes, they were the rulers of England. This is her lover, or favorite, I should say, Clifford, wearing his costume for that. And these jousting carousels, they really continue through the 18th century. That's the 18th century costume, sort of armor costume for a courtly pageant. They wouldn't actually be hitting each other at that point, but really still, 17th and 18th century, they do this. And people even tried reviving this in the 19th century, the famous Eglinton tournament, which was held in Eglinton, Scotland. Of course, if you're ever in Scotland, you know it rains all the time. So it was unsurprisingly mostly rained out. But the reason why this could take place, well, and it could be a big spectacle that drew a lot of people, was the railroad had happened, and people could now go to fairly distant locations fairly easily. So you got a whole bunch of middle-class people turn up in the sodden field in Scotland in order to watch these rich idiots run each other on horseback, and it went kind of disastrously because no one had any idea what they're doing. But it was entirely made possible as a spectator sport and a revival by the railroad and the use of travel of the railroad. This is very, very modern technology in the 19th century. And of course, it also had clear political overtones because at this point, I think it was 1839, that there was this movement called Chartism in England, which people wanted to move rights forward and give the vote to the working class. And this is obviously a Tory, which is to say a conservative spectacle, which is saying that the rights of the classic aristocracy, using symbology drawn from, of course, Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, which was the Game of Thrones of the early 19th century. They were all into that. And saying, no, this is, let's go back to the past, right? This is using the Middle Ages for an explicitly conservative statement. The same way, this is modern Calcia Historica. I love the expression on that guy's face on the left. He's like, oh, crap, I got the ball. Now they're going to kill me. But Mussolini revised something called the old Calcio Fiorentino, the Florentine kicking game, Calcio's kick, right, literally a kicking game. And he revives this. It's Calcio Storico, it's kind of like rugby, but it's also like MMA. In Florence, they just beat the living crap out of each other. And he revives this as part of the fascist revival. It's a 16th century game that he's reviving, not a medieval game, but this is part of the fascist looking back at the past, the fascist revival of the glories of the Italian past. And also, it's manly and brutal and good warrior training, right? Which brings us really to the other thing I want to discuss, which is modern medievalist sports. So what did we look at so far, right? I looked at, I could have done a lot more. Maybe I should have had even more slides. I had a whole bunch of slides, but even more slides. But I wanted to talk about, what I did talk about, I talked about masculinity, I talked about femininity, I talked about the Northern Southern European marriage pattern, I talked about this idea of habitus, right, from the get-go. And I talked about the construction of nobility through the knightly tournament and how that changed, right? That changed with the development of state formation. So these are a lot of themes that we historians are very interested in. Where did modern states come from? What does it mean to be a man? How does it mean to be a woman? Where does that come from? How has that been constructed historically? How is social class constructed? Right? Can we see social class consciousness? How are these things like things that happen today? But I want to turn from that for a moment, and I want to talk a little bit about modern medieval sports and how these ideas, the idea of the Middle Ages is played out in today, right? Modern stuff that you might see, things that you could conceivably do. So, and I want to talk about maybe also some of the more troublesome uses of this, and maybe question some of the things that we associate with the Middle Ages. Okay? So let's get into our modern medievalist sports. So first thing, what is medievalism? Well, here's Richard Utz, a friend of mine from Georgia Tech, who wrote a really nice, very, very thin little book on medievalism. What is medievalism? Medievalism is the ongoing and broad cultural phenomenon of reinventing, remembering, recreating, and reenacting the Middle Ages. So it's thinking of the Middle Ages today. It's everything from Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is medievalism, right? Renaissance fair is medievalism. Anything like that. Disney movies in some ways are medievalism, right? You can probably think of a whole bunch of other medievalisms. Anyway, we think with the Middle Ages, use the Middle Ages, reenact the Middle Ages even mentally, even including the academic study of the Middle Ages. Medieval studies, the academic study of medieval culture, focused on establishing the real Middle Ages, supposedly this positivist idea that we can somehow perfectly know the past, know what the Middle Ages truly were, is one essential contributor to the cultural phenomenon of medievalism. But here he's taking this, and it's much broader. It's something that doesn't just happen in the classroom, right? It's not just the academic medieval studies, but the Middle Ages. I mean, we academics do not own the Middle Ages. You all have an idea. If I say the Middle Ages, you all have something pops into your head, right? We can talk about Aquinas' idea of mind later. But we all have an idea of the Middle Ages. We all have feelings about the Middle Ages, you know, and it's used in a lot of different ways. The confluence, and one thing that's really interesting is that people have been looking at this using critical theory, right? How is the idea of the Middle Ages used to construct a certain power regime in our world? To give you an example, if I say the Middle Ages, you probably think of a very white time without many people of color, right? But was that true? Is that a thing, right? And then what does it mean for things to be medieval, right? Is the Middle Ages a time, you know, when it was a all-white culture, and when people talk about the Middle Ages, and they try evoking today, is that necessarily exclusive of people of color? Is it necessarily a patriarchal time when women were excluded? And some of the most important work being done in this is done outside the academy, because if you know anything about academia today, it's kind of a mess. The humanities are being kind of really defunded outside of Catholic schools. And that a lot of people who are especially academically trained medievalists are working as independent scholars. But also there's people who say, you know, why would I go to grad school and get a doctorate in medieval history? It's kind of ridiculous. I'm interested in the Middle Ages, but I don't need a doctorate to do that. I can do good work outside of the academy. So a lot of the good work in this is being done by para-academics. So medievalism, in a way, right, the study of the Middle Ages, both in and outside of the academy, isn't undisciplined, right? I want to decenter this locale, this geography of the classroom, as a place where the study of the Middle Ages happens. Understand? And I want you to think that. Which means, of course, that we really need to change how we think about how we do history, which I want to go to, right? So, right, just another bit of what I was talking about, what the Middle Ages are, right? Not just of the Middle Ages themselves, but of the modern study of the Middle Ages. That's Leo Workman's definition. He's one of the fundamental people from that. Includes the entire idea of the Middle Ages. And it's really, you know, in many ways, sort of its own field of study above and beyond the study of the Middle Ages. I want to point out that I am fully participatory in this, that I am not only, again, someone with a PhD in medieval history, but I'm someone who actively engages with communities outside, Renaissance fair people, you know, participates in jousting. I teach fencing in Worcester, historical fencing. I teach style of fencing reconstructed from these fencing books I was talking about before, the Fechtbücher, which I don't want to get too much into because that's kind of its own topic and outside our purpose today. But yeah, I started doing this at the Higgins Armory Museum, which was in Worcester. I started doing it like 2009. And for the past 11 years, I got a fencing master certification. And besides being an academic medievalist with all those tools, linguistic, theoretical, what have you, I am also able to quite effectively coach people in fencing. Of course, I'm also pretty good at riding horses and hitting people with sticks while doing so. Plus, I have armor, which is, you know, just awesome. Really, just, you know, if you can get armor, I just recommend getting armor. So, yeah, so I'm totally with this. So one big community, probably the biggest medievalist community in which medievalist sporting events take place is the Society for Creative Anachronisms. Anyone ever heard of the SCA? Show of hands, anyone ever hear of this? It is like 30,000 persons strong at least, organization, mostly in the United States, but with chapters throughout the world. Which organization of people dedicated to recreating, and I use the term recreating in the sense of recreation as well as making anew the Middle Ages. And their primary activity is this thing on the left, which is what they call heavy weapons fighting, in which they wear armor, often specialized for sporting, and they whack each other with sticks, both in one-on-one combat, usually on foot, most often on foot, like 99.9% on foot, and also in these sort of mass battles that every July, August, over July, last week of July, first week of August, there is a tremendous event in Western Pennsylvania in which like 10,000 plus people come. You can get 1,000 to 2,000 on the battlefield at one time because not everyone, of course, is a fighter. And they have at it. It's like an enormous participatory 24/7 Renaissance fair, quite magical except for the fact that I-79 is right there and the trucks just engine braking wake you up in the middle of the night. And this is very, very meaningful, of course, to the participants. The king, this is a SCA king right there, right? He won his job because they have a stick fighting tournament, which is not unlike modern sport. It's all in the honor system. There's no judging. You say when a blow is good. And he has won king, and now look, all the people, the knights, they're all swearing fealty to him. They take this very, very seriously in their subculture. There's a household. I guess they are Rus of some sort, and they're all dressed alike in their tent. And people put a lot of money and effort into this. So it's a lot of different things, right? So my friend Mike Kramer wrote a great book called Medieval Fantasy as Performance, published in 2011. And he talks about the SCA as performance, right? It's a community. It's a performance, but it's a participatory performance, right? If you think about a mass, right, that's some sort of performance as well, but it's a performance that also enacts community. It's a postmodernism, right? It's a taking of traditional symbols and structure and meaning and a rewriting of it to create meaning. It is in many ways, because the SCA started in Berkeley, California in 1966, in many ways an expression of dissatisfaction with contemporary society. Or sometimes abstract construction of value, of merits. If you feel especially, and the SCA, I have to say, is very often a very blue-collar activity. If you feel disenfranchised from modern society, well, you can create meaning and also gain status for yourself within the subculture. Many subcultures are like that. The SCA is unique in that status ultimately comes from a sporting activity, the stick fighting tournaments. And all of this is deeply, deeply meaningful to the participants, right? We mustn't think this is a game or goofy, right? That, this is something that is very, very important to the people. There's others as well, right? This is from David Perry, who has a PhD in medieval history, but is currently working as a journalist. That medievalism's like this, right? And also, another one I participate in, the historical European martial arts movement. This attempt to make medieval sword fighting into a modern, sort of rationalized sport, right? And we have tournaments and there's groups nearby. I teach in Worcester. I think there's a group in Rhode Island and Providence. But people who studied these old medieval manuscripts about sword fighting try to recreate these skills and get together for meets and tournaments, right? This is something that is done. But is this a problem? Can we see this problem? What does this mean? And is this a place, just like the SCA, if you kind of have a blue-collar job, maybe you feel a bit disenfranchised in modern society, and you invest your emotional and social energy in the subculture, and you get something from that, people often invest different things in these other subcultures. So one thing David Perry says about medievalisms, and don't forget that these modern medievalisms often take the form of sporting culture, right? Sporting products, differentiating yourself through sport. Because they imagine it was pure white Christian place organized wholesomely and around military resistance to outside non-white, non-Christian forces, right? This is a succinct statement of many of the problematic uses of medievalism, right? And to which I can add, perhaps promoting, because again, this idea of masculinity, promoting maybe a culture of toxic masculinity. This is another example. This is Victoria Cooper. I don't know if you consider video games as a sport, but she gave a paper that became kind of controversial at the big medieval conference that happens every year in Kalamazoo. And she gave this 5 years ago in 2015. And she had a quote from it that envisioning the Middle Ages as a place that is gritty, white, male, and powerful, a place where whiteness can be anchored in a happy history where a world is free of multiculturalism and white guilt. In other words, using the Middle Ages and using medieval sporting products to construct this world. I have a little chart, which I like to use, and that characterizes a lot of the rhetoric that you see in the medieval recreationist community. And in this, I'm including a broad variety of communities. I'm including the Society for Creative Anachronism. I'm including this historical European martial arts movement. I'll consider the Armored Combat League. Anyone see Night Fight on the History Channel at all? There was a show called Night Fight, it's sort of like the SCA fighting. They use steel weapons, and they have these, it's very brutalist. I like to hurt people. I like to hear people get hurt, right? And that people create these rhetorics and strategies of difference by purposely differentiating, for instance, this neo-medieval form of combat sport from, say, modern fencing. You're all familiar with modern fencing, right? Dress up like a beekeeper, plug yourself in, fence épée, lots of fun, like épée. Tend not to get your wrists broken as much as with broadswords, I say from personal experience. But people like to differentiate themselves. In the SCA, they do this to differentiate their stick fighting game from another game they have in the SCA, which is played with fencing weapons and rapiers, more through musketeers rather than Lancelot. And so, looking at this, right? So, the medieval earlier, right? Renaissance later, right? Or modern, we put modern there. It's a narrative of decline, right? It's a certain view of history that in the past, people were brutal, right? They had to get winched up on their horses because their armor is so heavy, which of course was not true at all. My armor is sure not heavy. I use a mounting block because I like my horse and I don't want to break his back, but I could mount from the ground if I wanted to. People in the Middle Ages were not stupid brutes, right? This idea of the Middle Ages is people were dumb. They were, like the dumb jock idea. But then people valorized this. So, medieval, right? Heavier, right? Heavier is better, manlier. You got to be stronger, right? Renaissance, it's lighter, it's more effeminate, it's degraded, right? The swords were lighter. Therefore, they're not as good. A good sword is a heavy sword. No, not at all. Not in the Middle Ages, not ever. So the Middle Ages has to be strong. The Renaissance, it's weak, it's effete. Medieval, robust. Renaissance, fragile. Well, if I hit your rapier with my broadsword, I'd break it. Enduring versus yielding. Combative versus sportive. Well, this is real fighting, right? I'm constantly told by people, well, we do real fighting. No, are people dying? Well, ideally, no, we have insurance. The insurers don't want us to kill people. So it's a sport then, right? If people aren't dying, it's a sport, okay? It's sportive. It's manly versus effeminate, right? Earlier, manly, right? Free versus constrained. This idea, why do people like the Vikings so much? The Vikings were free. No, the Vikings lived in these suffocating communities where people had to be very, very close together in order to survive, to work together, to survive in a harsh environment. The Vikings were not free, right? The Vikings hated it so much that that's why they became Vikings, right? I got to get out of here. I'm going to go raid France. So versus constraint, somehow that it's bad to live with a system of laws and a strong state. But the anarchy of medieval life, supposed anarchy, it wasn't really anarchic, was better, right? That it's authentic versus artificial. In other words, the Middle Ages is seen as embodying a lot of these blue-collar qualities, right? I was talking about blue-collar sports, white-collar sports, right? That the Middle Ages are the MMA, the boxing, right? The football, right? The later things, it's the yoga, the jogging, right? in actuality, it was all, we're talking about, it was all polo, right? It's all polo, dangerous, highly skilled, and very expensive. But this is in the popular imagination the way these things are. And this often gets thrown back to the way that the Middle Ages are seen as similarly an all-white space. So this is an example. This is in historical European martial arts. We have a white supremacist problem. So this is a HEMA jacket, right? It's one of the commercially available jackets for HEMA. It's just basically a very heavy fencing jacket. People like to wear black because it's much manlier. Also, they have to wash the stuff less often, which is why my club wears white. And that's a messer. A messer is a sort of 16th, 15th, really became popular in the 15th century, 16th century German weapon, sort of like a machete. Of course, it's much manlier than a saber. It's heavier, right? It's a fencing version. You can see it's blunted. And it literally means knife, right? People would carry these because legally they were knives because they've got, instead of having a peen pommel, they've got a scale hilt construction, like a knife, right? If you look at your dinner knife, it's got like rivets that hold the scales of the handle on, the wooden parts, right? Those are called scales. Whereas a sword pommel is peened over. So legally, though, it's a knife. So even though it's about an arm long, you can carry it around. But this is obviously, very, very manly. And then it's laid over the jacket, and what the jacket has on it is an Operation Werewolf patch on it. I don't know if you can see that there. What is Operation Werewolf? Well, it's basically Fight Club / motorcycle club for white supremacists. If you read Jack Donovan, who is a ironically gay white supremacist writer who says that the basic social unit should be the gang. He's sort of an anarchist. But they're sort of like, it's like a blue collar, disenfranchised group who who make themselves out to be kind of like a CrossFit fitness group, but they've named themselves after the Nazi resistance movement against Allied occupation after World War II, which was Operation Werewolf. And so they decided to call themselves this, and they see themselves in essentially a struggle with modernity, right? That they're going to form these groups, these social units, like outlaw biker clubs, right? Certain appeal to that, but here they're kind of reacting against multicultural, constrained, rules-based social justice environment of the modern world, because ultimately social justice is, let's not forget, a legal discourse that usually aims to use state power to modify behavior. So another example, right? This has been made much of. These shields, right? Shields similar to the ones used in modern medieval sports. You saw them in the SCA slide. Being used by, in this case, the the Workers' Party, right? These, they had this march in Sacramento. You saw people carrying shields and stuff in Charlottesville as well in 2016. There's instructions for these. Oh, well, are you going to go to the protest or the counter-protest? Are you going to go fight Antifa? Well, here's how you make a shield, right? And the people using these shields, which ultimately come from like LARPing, which come from the SCA, for this, they can show your logos. You can show whose side, which side you're on. And it kind of bleeds over into this. So that's what's kind of the ways in which these medieval sporting products, right, modern medievalists, people do it for fun, right? I do it. It's a lot of fun. I like doing it. I have sort of a romantic attachment to it. But also, I wanted to point out, and I don't by this want to give you the idea that all or even most or even a very large percentage of the people who participate in this stuff are white supremacists or sexist or toxic. Well, a lot of them are toxically masculine, but myself included. But I don't want to give you the idea that it's like some haven for white supremacists. It's not. Most people are extremely open and tolerant. In fact, I want to say that the SCA and also the HEMA are way more diverse than academic medievalism. I go to a medieval history conference, and most people are white, right? Most people are white. And it's because you need a bunch of privilege in order to do that, in order to do something stupid like get a PhD in medieval history. I don't recommend it to anybody. Father Vidmar's shaking his head. Yeah, I don't recommend you do that, or you'll wind up unemployable like me. But anyone can join the SCA. Anyone can join a HEMA group. Anyone can participate in this. And so I see a lot more people of color. I mean, I haven't done any sort of scientific survey, but a lot more people of color, a lot more working class people, a lot more trans people, a lot more visibly queer people, et cetera, in HEMA, in the SCA, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, I'd say that they're refuges for diversity, right? That these subcultures, communities are wonderful, wonderful places if you are a weirdo like me. But I also want to say that some of these received ideas we have about the Middle Ages, heavier, brutal time, right? Oh, it's so brutal, Game of Thrones. Brutal is what it was really like back then, very brutal. Yes, everyone was being raped all the time. That idea of the Middle Ages, which of course, of course that happened in the Middle Ages, it happens today, right? But this idea that the Middle Ages were this, time of Frazetta painting barbarians, Conan, right? And that has a certain appeal. But I want to emphasize that what I want to bring out in this is that this idea of the Middle Ages makes them appealing to certain segments of society, certain people who feel disenfranchised, and just in the same way that people might go for alt-right ideas for other reasons, right? Participate in other, maybe more toxic ideas. They can also employ these ideas in the Middle Ages for this. All right, I want to leave some time for questions and for discussion. So I got some questions on the screen. And also, if anyone has some questions for you, and I also figured you guys might want to ask me some questions. So which would you like to do first? Would you like to ask me questions? Or maybe I can throw some questions out to you. You can read them yourself. So what do y'all think? First thing, let's ask. Does anyone have any? Let's start from the first. Anyone have any questions for me? So you all hear a story about Kitty Genovese? This is what we call the bystander effect. Big lecture hall, right? You're all invisible. I can't see you, right? But this is why I always rearrange the chairs, my classrooms into a circle. He stood here. What? All right. Well, I have some questions for you. All right. Well, maybe we can discuss these in the seminar. But what medieval? Who here's been to a Renaissance fair? Okay. Who's seen the Lord of the Rings movies? Who's seen the Harry Potter movies? Who's seen a Disney movie set in like a faux medieval kingdom? Or like Shrek or something like that? Yeah, a lot more people, right? So anyone been to an SEA event? Anyone interested by that stuff, or is it just like not too much in your, anyone have like a burning obsession with this stuff? No one, you see. That's good. I'm looking then at a classroom of people who have the potential to actually make decent salaries one day. Excellent. And not spend it on armor. Let me ask you another question. So, and this can be broader in general. If people online, if the alt-right is appropriating the past, what can be done about it? What can we as academic historians do about people, we academic medievalists, do about people appropriating the Middle Ages to create an imagined idea of a manly, masculine, patriarchal, was of course patriarchal to some degree, right? But toxically masculine, all white Middle Ages. Can we do anything? We have someone getting paid 6 figures at Facebook to censor medieval memes that don't fit the plan. So when reviewing all the Insta feeds. So what can be done? Shouldn't anything be done? Or is that something that has to happen not from the top down, from the bottom up in a grassroots kind of way? Which is the other, right, sort of way of achieving social change. We've got top down, right? Think Title IX, right? Top down, right? You will do this or you will lose funding. Bottom up, grassroots. Give us this. Give us equal resources, right? Another way of maybe achieving a more just world is through grassroots movement. So these are all, I think, good questions, right? You know, are these worthwhile questions, right? Should gender be studied? You know, or is this part of the liberal agenda in the college classroom? Or class differentiations? Who thought that the distinctions I drew today were useful? Useful categories. Just who thought that I was maybe overcomplicating things with modern concerns? That's the thing, right? Who here thought about white nationalist uses of the medieval past before today? No one, right? Learn something new about that? Hopefully. All right. All right, I'm going to get a last chance. Any questions? Going once, going twice? All right. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That is accurate. That's what was done for most of it. Or you can ransom them back, of course, if you've been defeated. But also there's other stuff too, like there'd be a grand prize. William the Marshal once won a large fish. That was his prize. He won a large fish. But then other times there'd be a prize for who jousted the best, where you wouldn't lose horses, particularly later on in the 15th century, 16th century. You'd get a prize for the best performance, which was often not really determined through actual scoring. It was often a little political, shall we say. And then also, there would, of course, be festivities and dances and balls. And there'd also be a prize given to the lady who danced the best and lived the finest, most graceful, most noble life. So basically, there's a reward for showing habitus, right? That idea of habitus again. Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was going to ask you, do you do that? Or, because there's also, groups that do, where there's actually a win.
Yeah. So what you're asking is the difference between your uncle doing this sort of in terms of theatrical, right? Showing, not wearing safety gear and all of that, and showing people in a performance versus people actually competing. And that's a very good question. Which brings me to the distinction between fight choreography and fencing competition, which are diametrically opposed. Because if I'm doing a theatrical fight, my concern is first not to hit my partner, right? That both my partner and the audience, especially the audience, should be safe. So I'm trying not to hit them. Secondly, I'm trying to show a third party, the audience, what I'm doing for purposes of furthering a dramatic plot, right? It's predetermined, right? It fits in that, in a sense, the fighting, the combat is part of the acting, right? And so I'm showing, right, and demonstrating to a third party something for dramatic purposes while trying not to hit the other person and work with them and cooperate to produce a dramatic story. In a fencing competition, and of course you're not usually wearing protective gear. In fact, you're never wearing protective gear almost when you're doing theatrical combat. I remember an episode of Happy Days where the Fonz fences a French fencing champion, and they do it without masks because it's theatrical. And Henry Winkler, as Fonzie says to the camera, remember that anyone who fences without a mask is no friend of mine, right? Very wholesome, happy days. But in an actual fencing competition, one, you wear protective gear because you're actually trying to strike the other person. And I don't care what the audience says, because I'm not trying to work with my partner to show a third party, the audience, what's happening. Rather, I'm trying to deceive my partner as to what's happening so that I can trick and hit them and strike them and defeat them and frustrate them. And any aesthetic concern is a distant second or third concern over and above trying to win the competition. Does that make sense? So that's the difference between choreography and actual fencing competition or other sorts of competition. Any other questions?
I want to just explain a couple of things about the reading. So the quiz this week will be on the readings and on this lecture. But also I want to set up the reading from Ivanhoe. You have to remember it's written in 1820. And Sir Walter Scott is very much a creature of the Enlightenment. So he has got a lot of kind of exaggerated ideas about what the Middle Ages were actually like. And he's painting in very broad strokes. So one of the big conflicts, that's what I want you to look at in that reading. It's going to be a jousting tournament that you have in a couple of those chapters. One is the Normans have conquered England. Okay? And so you have this very heavy influence, which you're going to see in the names are going to be very French. And the tension there is that the Saxons are the ones who have been in England, and they have been defeated. So there's this tension about we're the losers, the Normans are the winners, and the Saxons are always thinking about getting their land back. I mean, and it's not going to happen. But one of the big characters is going to be Prince John, who is the brother of the King of England, Richard III. Richard the Lion-Hearted has gone off to the Holy Land to fight in the Crusades. On his way back, he is captured, basically, I think in Austria, and is imprisoned because they want a big ransom for him. But the question now, so his brother pretty much takes over in England and wants to continue, knowing that his brother Richard is still alive, still claims to be the king, and may try to get back in some ways. If he escapes from prison or is ransomed and he makes his way back to England, you're going to have the potential for civil war. So the two knights who show up in this competition, one is going to be called the Disinherited Knight. He's the main player in this. That is going, I'm going to give away a lot of the story because you're not going to read the whole book. But that is Ivanhoe. He is going to be a knight who's going to be basically defending the honor of Richard III. Another knight shows up at the very end of the reading called the Black Knight. His identity is not known. It's like, where did he come from? What's he doing? He helps out Ivanhoe, really saves Ivanhoe's life in this story. That is Richard III. Okay, that will be revealed later on in the book, the Black Knight, who kind of comes and goes very mysteriously, and he's out of the picture. So that's going to be a major conflict, is between the Normans, the Saxons, between Prince John and his brother Richard, and also you're going to find a certain broad strokes. The clergy are going to look pretty bad in this. The bishop is very, he's wealthy, he's overweight, he's very much looking at the girls who are in the crowd, that kind of thing. So his opinion of the church, of the Catholic Church, is very low, which is very typical, again, of the Enlightenment. You're also going to have the figure of a Jew and his daughter. And they are going to be a subject for ridicule among some of the crowd. They are going to be favored by Prince John because Prince John, this guy is a money lender, and so he's going to need money, and he's going to have to be nice to this person. You're also going to have tension, and the last one is the tension between the Jewish moneylender's daughter, who's Rebecca, and the Saxon princess, who is Rowena, okay? And so all of that those are conflicts that are all going to be part of the story. And I'll shoot out a few questions for you later today. And okay, I think we're good. Thanks very much for your. Thanks.